And I notice there's always a bit of a lag when I go back and watch the recordings. I notice that there's a lag from the time I actually press the button till the time that slide pops up. So I'm going to try to be a little more ahead of schedule and press that button sooner, because it seems like I'm already down through the second or third bullet item before the slide actually changes. So I think that's related to my using satellite internet now. Just placed an order for the Starlink internet that Elon Musk is putting in the sky. Hopefully we'll have even better improved service come June. So meanwhile, okay, week 15. We're getting down to the point where we'll be wrapping up here with Amos. Got 2 chapters today, and with any luck 2 chapters next week, and then we'll move on to Obadiah. But this week here we're going to study chapter 6 and 7, and we just got through wrapping up with more of the discussions of the day of the Lord and Israel's charges of what they have and have not been doing. So chapter 6 kind of continues on with that, but then chapter 7 starts getting into more of the true prophecy, because chapter 6 is just more finger pointing and telling them what they're doing wrong. And you know, as we've shared, that Amos kind of got their attention by criticizing everybody else, and then when he turned it around on them, well, then they weren't quite as receptive. And so we'll even talk about that a little bit later in chapter 7 as well. But chapter 6 just starts out again with reminding them of a warning about their continuous indulgent lust for comfort and luxury. It says, "Woe to you who are at ease in Samaria and trust in Mount Samaria." So they're more or less saying, you're just living for today. You're focused more on yourself and everything and your wealth. As we've said, they're taking advantage of people. They're stealing, thieving, causing violence and everything else. But it's kind of like all the anytime we see a movie about Rome or whatever, you know, everybody's just laying around and eating grapes and drinking wine and being entertained. And that's kind of what they're doing here. And you know, again, it's because everything was going well. And when people are doing well, they tend to ignore or don't go to God as often as they do when things aren't going well. So they just wanted to revel in their wealth and party. And on the rare occasions when they would go to temple and worship, it was usually a carnal worship, in that they were worshiping idols and calves and everything. They were worshiping everything but God. And they were going to temples that were tending to be, you know, just worshiping things that they shouldn't, being filled with lust and prostitution and everything else. And so God then uses an example here. He points to 3 cities. My text says, "Go over to Calneh and see, and from there go to Hamath the Great, and then go down to Gath of the Philistines." He says, "Are you better than these kingdoms, or is their territory greater than your territory?" And these cities, you know, while they may seem insignificant, is the history of these 3 cities is that they were once as illustrious and prideful as Samaria and Bethel and everywhere else, but yet they still got overthrown and destroyed in history. So he's saying, you know, are you any better than these people? And he's using them as an example of what could befall them. And so these fallen cities served as warnings to the people of Samaria, who assumed their city was indestructible. And that kind of reminds you of the youth that go out and do daring things and that kind of stuff, because they think they're indestructible sometimes too. And now you get to be our age and stuff, and you know, we're short stepping it in the snow and ice, because we know that if we fall, it's going to hurt bad. So he's trying to at least open their eyes, saying, you're no better than some of these other cities, whether you're the chosen people or not. Things could happen. And I've been warning you of this for, it seems like forever. And in verse 3, God accuses them of procrastinating and living their life as if the day of the Lord is nowhere in sight. Verse 3 says, woe to you who put far off the day of doom. It's like they're living for today, and they know that someday they're going to have to face the music or whatever, but they think it's a long time off. And God's saying, you don't know when that day is going to get here, and that's why you should be prepared at all times. And so, and I'm slow on the slides again, but so I sent out these questions last week, and I actually got them out early for a change. But the first question I came up with is that chapter 6 begins with the charge that Zion is at ease, which could be described as complacency. And so I wanted to ask, in what ways is our nation complacent, and what kinds of similar pitfalls could we fall into?
I think a lot of us have plenty, although sometimes we tend to think we don't when we compare ourselves to other people, but we have plenty, and we can get complacent and just give God very little time.
Right. Yeah. And perhaps sometimes I tend to take a jab at current administrations and things, but I was also thinking too about, our nation as a whole and our political leaders and things, tending to be complacent, and that I find it odd that we are putting our troops on a border and staring at somebody that we do business with. We are potentially going to be pointing a gun at somebody that we buy oil from. And the same could be said with China. China is a big threat to our way of life and things like that. And I think everybody realizes it, but yet we continue to borrow money from them and go to the Olympics and sponsor their Olympics in their country and everything else. And it just, I was trying to think of that would be like Mike and Laura borrowing money from Walgreens so that they could purchase pills from them and stuff. It's like, why do you do business with your enemies? And I guess it kind of goes back to the whole, keep your friends close and your enemies closer kind of mentality. But it troubles me that we can't protect our own borders, but yet we can send thousands of troops and millions and billions of dollars to another country to protect their border. And I get it that it's a little bit different, but the open borders is allowing, we're getting complacent and allowing threats to come into our country. I mean, the majority or some of the people that they're capturing are not from South American countries or Central America. They're coming from Africa and Europe and everything else. And I guess I'm getting on a soapbox here, but so let me ask if anybody else has any other examples or wants to add to that.
One thing I wonder about is the greed for money and not being responsible for, like I hear things like the other countries are buying so much of our country up, selling property and stuff like that.
Yes.
Yeah, that's true, because I don't know how much of it is reality and that kind of stuff, but I mean, we know that a lot of them are pulling money out of their countries and bringing it over here and buying properties for investment. But you used to hear that 60 to 70% of Hawaii was owned by the Japanese and different things at one point. So, but yeah, it's a shame that we can't have a jubilee that on the 50th year all the property goes back to its original owners, but that might mean that everything goes back to the Native Americans again. I don't know, but yeah, that is somewhat of a concern that we've somewhat become so much of a melting pot and that kind of stuff that, and with the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, Americans probably own very little of the property anymore nowadays, it seems like. And by the same token, our people, our billionaires, are going out and buying properties in other countries as well too, whether it be Europe or Mexico and places like that. So I guess, we're probably just as guilty as the people that are coming here.
Yeah.
So well, continuing on then with the warnings to Zion and Samaria, reading through some of the commentaries, there's a lot of people that have interpreted the second part of verse 3 to mean a lot of different things. There's the second part of verse 3 says, "Who caused the seed of violence to come near," and some of them have interpreted that simply means that they're allowing violence to occur within the walls of their city. And we could probably spend another hour or two of talking about that being a possibility here in our country, because, violence and everything else is a huge topic right now going on, and who's to blame and so on. But when I read that verse, I kind of took a different approach than the commentaries. I felt more like it was a warning that their complacency and lack of attention has made Israel a target for the Assyrian invasion. In other words, the enemy is near and things. And so that's the kind of ties back into that question. And I think sometimes our complacency is opening us up, for possibilities of major violence and getting back into war again.
Yeah.
And the whole Russian-Ukrainian thing, I don't think that either Putin or Biden have any intention whatsoever of starting a skirmish or anything else. But what troubles me is that it only takes Satan to get into the mind of one soldier out there, and whether it be intentionally or accidentally discharge a weapon, things can go bad very quickly and escalate. And there are rogue soldiers and rogue generals and everything else. And I think that, like we said, whether it's lifting the sanctions on Iran and letting them advance their nuclear program or anything else, I think that we do things that set us up for major problems, and things can go sideways very quick. And if you've ever done any research or tried to look at, the 7 signs of the coming of Christ and different things, there are some that talk about, in Revelation, that the fire of the sky could be nuclear weapons and things like that. You kind of wonder, like we said, is if things can escalate or whatever, whether it's China, crowding Taiwan or Russia trying to go into Ukraine and stuff, you kind of wonder if things like this can't possibly escalate into a Revelation type event or a day of the Lord. So
yeah.
But that's the way I interpreted that verse. Sorry if I continue to get off on tangents, but every once in a while I'll come up with something different than the commentaries that you read. Verses 4 through 6 then kind of point out the lifestyle we talked about earlier with verse 1. It talks about the gluttony that they like to just lay around all day on beds of ivory, getting anointed with oil and different things. They pig out on lamb and steaks and listen to music and overindulge on wine. there's so many images right there that could come into your head about, our country and our lifestyles, whether it's listening to podcasts or having, 1,000 bottle wine cellars and everything else. People just tend to overindulge. And I heard a really interesting quote yesterday. I was watching a movie, and I think it was by Albert Pike, who was, one of the Masonic Freemasons and things. And he said that the things that we do for us will die with us, but the things that we do for others and for the world will be immortal and things. And so reading and hearing that just kind of reminds me a lot about this study here, that we're being too prideful in doing things that make us feel good. Just like the people in Israel, the majority of our nation and the people of Israel, they're just 100% focused on their earthly pleasures and treasures, and not thinking about the big picture and the end game. So, and God goes on to point out that they're oblivious to the fact that they're basically casting righteousness into a pit, kind of much like the brothers did to Joseph. Might be a little bit of a stretch here, but the verse, which verse was that? Was that verse 6? But are not grieved for the affliction of Joseph. They threw him into a pit, and then they just went to their camp and started eating and stuff, and didn't even think about it after they sold him off. And but then God kind of points out that, because you're living this lifestyle and you don't have a care in the world and you don't care about others, you're going to be taken into captivity. And the people that are the most prideful, the most greedy and lazy and stuff, they're going to be at the front of the line. When they get strung up on fish hooks and led to Assyria, they're going to be the leaders. So they want to be the leaders of the nation now. They're going to be the leaders on the way to Assyria as well. And that's just for the ones that are actually going to get invited to the trip, the ones that don't get killed or kept there. Starting with verse 8, then God goes on to start describing the coming destruction of the cities and the houses and so on. And some of this can be a little bit confusing. Again, different commentators have come up with a lot of different things, but what it's more or less saying in verses 8 through 10 is that Israel was taking pride in its palaces, and the walls and the towers seemed to make the city of Samaria impregnable. They think that, that they've got the military might and all that kind of stuff, but they don't realize what's coming. And so, they're boasting, they're proud of their cities and their homes and everything. But, as we saw throughout the Gospels and everything, God didn't favor the prideful and everything. He actually resists the proud and says, those who think they should be at the front of the table should be at the ends of the table, and those that tend to go sit at the end of the table should be at the head of the table. So God would rather give preferential treatment to the humble and not the prideful. So if somebody would have taken that same wealth and done something good with it and helped others, he might have had a different outlook on Israel at the time. And the same was in the Gospels is kind of reflected here in Israel during the time of Amos too. God hates these lavish homes and palaces, and he basically says, I'm going to deliver up the city. I'm going to break I thought these words were kind of interesting. He will break the great house into bits and the little house into pieces. Well, apparently a piece is smaller than a bit, I guess, but he makes it he makes it clear it doesn't matter how large your house is or how many of them you have. I'm going to destroy them. So be ready for that. Verse 9 and 10 kind of go on as an extension of that verse. It says, if there are 10 men, I believe it says, if 10 men remain in one house, they shall die. And when a relative of the dead with one who will burn the bodies picks up the bodies to take them out of the house, he will say to one inside the house, are there any more with you? Then someone will say none. And he will say, hold your tongue, for we dare not mention the name of the Lord. That was kind of some confusing verses right there. But the commentaries more or less are saying what they're trying to make reference here to is basically everybody's going to be brought down low. There's going to be a few remnants remaining and things. And those people are going to be responsible for the funerals or things for these dead people. And while it would be customary at a funeral or whatever to mention the name or the word of God and talk about, where they're going and all that kind of stuff, they're now saying they're going to be kind of cautionary because they shouldn't mention God's name at this time or as a part of these funerals and so on, because they feel like they're kind of cursed by God, and by mentioning his name or saying something incorrectly could make it even worse. So they're avoiding bringing up God at this time. Verse 12 kind of then goes on to start asking some of those rhetorical questions that God does from time to time. We kind of heard some of the obvious ones, a few chapters ago and stuff, but he's doing the same thing again here. Is, do horses run on rocks? Does one plow there with oxen? The obvious answer is no. But what God is trying to say here is what did you expect? You knew that this wasn't going to end well. I mean, God has been trying to tell them for hundreds of years. I mean, ever since they came out of Egypt, they started straying before they ever got to the promised land. So he kept a whole entire generation from going there. And then all the different chapters of Judges and going through the Kings and Chronicles and so on, you see repeatedly over and over and over again where God does not reward certain people, and he gives warnings and punishments and everything else. He oppresses people to try to power steer them back into a positive, and it just never works. So now here's another generation that still has not learned anything, and their actions and that kind of stuff, their idea of justice and everything, where they're buying judges and the corruption is so bad within the city that it's leaving a bitter taste in their mouth. There's a reference to the word gall, which is, basically bile and so on. So it's, basically your actions are kind of making you throw up in your mouth a little bit. And God goes on to say that, your attempt to be righteous is extremely flimsy. It's being built on the softest of materials like wormwood, which I think we talked about that a little bit last week as well too. It's a very, very thin wood. It's, not very strong. It's not like oak or something else that you would want to build a house with. But their attempts to be righteous is no different than the wood itself. Verse 13 is different in many of the texts, but they still all have the same meaning. New King James Version specifically calls out a couple of towns or cities, Lo-Debar and Karnaim, but other Bible versions don't use pronouns of cities or names. It uses the word not in place of Lo-Debar and horns in places of Karnaim. But these cities and towns, I guess the Israelites here are kind of bragging about, well, didn't we not go in and overtake these cities and towns and so on? And they're kind of bragging about something, and God is more or less saying, you just went in and took control over lowly places. If you look up Lo-Debar, it was considered a ghetto town, and the actual words Lo-Debar means no thing. And Karnaim was a declining region as well. Ashtaroth and Karnaim were both declining regions, so they just kind of joined forces and annexed or merged together into one bigger region. But what God's saying is okay, yeah, you went in and took control of these towns, but that was like the LA Lakers playing the Ravenswood Red Devils. So what? You didn't do anything spectacular. You went in with your military and took over, a couple of ghetto towns that were probably on the verge of completely falling anyway. So then going on, and we conclude chapter 6 in. I'm sorry.
That's right. My footnote says that Israel's great gain will amount to nothing. Sort of.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, they're expanding their borders and their territories, and they're not really gaining a whole lot. It's like you took over control of a bunch of barren land. You captured the desert. Woohoo! Yeah. It's it's not a great accomplishment, but in their sense of pride, they're patting themselves on the back, saying, "Look what we did," and everything, and they're showing their character as they're doing it. So in verse 14, then it kind of concludes with saying, because of your actions, your great and deep sin, God's going to hit them up with a real judgment. So there's a little bit of a prophecy here, and it's interesting that God is going to raise up or support another nation. Normally, we pray all the time for God to lift someone up or raise somebody up and support them. God is going to go to their enemies, and he's going to intentionally make them stronger so that they can come in then and attack Israel. So, instead of defending Israel and raising them up to learn from their mistakes, he's going to raise up their enemies. So it'll be no contest. And again, in 14, he uses one of those scornful call outs, like I said, where he says, "Oh, house of Israel." You can almost just see the scorn in that voice and the way he names them and everything. And then Amos concludes verse 14 with the prophecy that Israel is going to be affected thoroughly. It goes on to say, and they will afflict you from the entrance of Hamath to the valley of Arabah. Hamath is a place very far north. It's considered to be the northern limit of Israel's domain, but it's even further north than Damascus. So he's basically, saying to the north, we're going to get all of Israel as far north as they are. And the valley of Arabah is a geographical region that's just south of the Dead Sea, and it's considered to be the southern limit of Israel's domain, or almost along the borderline where it butts up against Judah. But if God was to say to the U.S. people, "I'm going to destroy you," he would use the extreme points of our nation and say, "I'm going to destroy the U.S. from Point Barrow, Alaska to Key West, Florida." He's basically saying it's all encompassing. No one's going to escape. And so that's sometimes why sometimes there's scripture in here that we don't exactly know what they're trying to say until you do a little bit of research on it. So chapter 7 then starts out with 3 of the visions, and then goes into some of the conversations with Amaziah. But the very first vision in chapter 7 is Amos. Now he starts making the prophecy in a way that sounds like a prophecy. He says, "Thus the Lord God showed me," and he does that again with the vision of the fire later. But now he's kind of covering his tracks here a little bit. This is not my words, this is God's words. And he's saying God is going to form a locust swarm, and the timing of this locust swarm is unique in that the growing season is pretty much over. They're at a time when not only they're getting ready to harvest, but some of the harvest has already began. And so, you can kind of see all of this money sitting out there in the field and that kind of stuff, this wealth and stuff, that we're just getting ready to go get it. And God's going to bring in a swarm of locusts. But the scripture points out that it's after the king's mowing. Well, what that means is, like today, we go out and harvest our own crops or make our own money, and then we have to turn around and write a check or give our taxes or a portion of that to our king, so to speak. What they did back in this time is the king's people would actually come to your field or whatever, and they would take their share, and they probably took the best part of the fields and things, or the easiest part that took the less labor, but they would come and take their taxes from the beginning, and then after they left, then you could have the rest. So if the king has already taken his portion and his people, and now the locust comes, well, it's not even like the king's portion. So the king's got his, he's set, he's got his in storage and everything, but the locust is going to eat the rest. So in other words, the Israelites are not going to get anything. But Amos then starts to see what could happen here, and perhaps he's got a soft heart or whatever. He is kind of a normal everyday layman and stuff, but he makes a plea to God to have mercy on the people. He says, Jacob is small, they won't survive. So in response to Amos's plea, God relents and he gives them a second chance. He staves off the coming of the locust. It says, "So the Lord relented concerning this, it shall not be, said the Lord." Now you can discuss this and say, is this predestiny? God knows everything that's going to happen before it happens. And so maybe he put the thoughts and the words in Amos's mind. Perhaps it could be that some of the people were starting to listen to Amos and trying to correct things. But no matter what, this is part of the God's plan and everything. Yeah. So verse 4 kind of repeats these same events, but you can just take out the word locust and put in the word fire for the most parts. But the highlights here that I think it's important to talk about is the people could have survived a locust swarm. If the locusts swarm in, they don't eat the people, they don't kill the people, but the people suffer and slowly die over time because they don't have any food to live on. But with a fire, a fire is going to come in and it's going to be immediately destructive. Quiet. Sorry. I'm puppy sitting again today. The fire is going to be intense. It's going to harm people immediately. It's going to destroy everything. And the description here is that it's going to be so hot and intense that it's going to penetrate deep. It just says, it uses the word deep in the scripture. And it basically means that, it's going to kill everything in the soil, grubs, earthworms, all the kind of stuff that kind of helps things grow. And it's even going to dry up the moisture that might even be trapped in the soil. So it's going to render the land pretty much useless after that. And so once again, Amos kind of feels their impending pain and doom. and feeling concern for the Israelites. And once again, he makes a plea to the Lord. And again, God relents and aborts the punishment. Something I wanted to point out here, though, is, these events, the way they occurred, could be troubling. I try to think about if somebody comes and makes a prophecy, and then they say, but I'm going to pray, or I'm going to plead that this not happen, and it doesn't happen. Well, then people could perceive that in that it was never going to happen in the first place. This was you just making a lot of drama over nothing. And the fact that Amos makes this prophecy and then it doesn't happen, I think could possibly harm Amos's credibility for a little bit. But so I kind of wondered, was that the right thing? So that kind of spurred a question here. It says, for the first two visions, locusts and fire, God was prepared to deal catastrophe to Israel, but upon Amos's request, God relented. So can you think of a really good reason why God would not move forward with those catastrophes that were shared in the prophecy?
Well, this is my simple answer. I said, just because Amos asked, and to show that for the sake of one, praying and asking can reach the heart of God, to show that God has power and that he has compassion.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're heading right down the same line that I was.
Yeah.
It's the power of prayer.
Mhm.
Amos probably knelt in front of all these people and prayed that God would not do this. Now, I think it would have been, more like a made-for-TV movie if you could see the swarm of locusts coming, or you could see the fireballs in heaven heading your way, and then Amos prayed, and then they went away. They just dispersed. We don't know if that's what happened or not. But again, I think the goal here was to show the people that if you pray and you are committed to God and everything, it's still God's plan, but you have a better chance of coming out on the good end of something like that if you are repentant and you pray to God. Anybody else have any other thoughts to add or share on that? Okay, well, the next vision is the vision of the plumb line. And, I guess this is where God brings the smart engineers and the people of the world into this as well too. But what was really interesting in this vision is that God makes an actual appearance in this vision. It says that God appeared on a wall built with a plumb line. And so he's delivering his message in person this time to Amos. He's God standing on this wall and he's holding a plumb line in his hand, and he begins to question Amos this time. He says, Amos, what do you see? And Amos replies, a plumb line. And so in this vision, Amos doesn't see a calamity that's about to approach, but rather he sees God, and he sees a metaphor for God's law itself. And a plumb line, back in this time, they didn't have pre-manufactured bricks that were made within certain tolerances or 2x4s and stuff. They probably were using common rubble or stone or hand-hewn blocks, which were never all the same size and everything. So it was not uncommon to hold up a plumb line to make sure that you were building the wall straight up and down vertically. And the metaphor here, though, is if you had a level, you think you could do that as the wall was being built, but the problem is you might not see it until the wall is nearly complete. And but what happens is you hold up the plumb line and you find out that it's leaning in one direction. the thought is it's going to fall down someday anyway if you don't fix it. So if a wall is straight in a vertical sense, then great, no big deal. But if the wall is not straight, you have to tear it down, destroy it, start all over. So that's basically what God is saying here is I'm going to set up this plumb line, and it's almost like drawing a line in the sand. As long as you don't cross it, you'll be okay. But he's saying here, Israelites, as long as you're following my standard of measure, then you're going to be good. But if you lean 1 inch one way or another, I'm not going to give you a pass anymore. I gave you a pass on the locust. I gave you a pass on the fire. But that's it. You get no more. You're not going to get a fourth chance. And we kind of know that he already did that because, when we first started Amos, it was for 3 sins and maybe 4. They've already had so many chances. He's more or less just saying, here's the rule, here's the law. If you cross it or you don't follow it, that's it. And then the verses here also then talk about, the high places of Isaac and the sanctuaries. Which verse was that? The high places of Isaac shall be desolate. Yeah, verse 9. The high places of Isaac shall be desolate, and the sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid to waste. The high places and the sanctuaries, usually when someone was going to worship or whatever, the temples and everything were built at least on a mound or up on the higher ground or whatever. So he's basically referencing temples or places of worship here. He's more or less saying, no more. Those were full of false idols and everything anyway. But I'm going to lay all that to waste. And then he concludes with probably one of the biggest threats is, he says, I will rise with the sword against the house of Jeroboam. So God's saying that, I'm going to rise up against your king. And so we'll after this question, we'll get more deeper into that scripture and what that statement did for Amos and everybody else. But the third and final question here is, God uses the metaphor of the plumb. You might only find it in 1 or 2 places in any Bible, but if you also look for plummet, that's the same thing as plumb. So it's used repeatedly in this period or in this era. They must have just discovered this plumb line recently, but it's in 2 Kings, Zechariah, and Isaiah. But he's using this metaphor again to measure people's actions. So the question is, we don't really have a plumb line here other than our Bible, but absent a plumb line or a Bible, how do most people today decide whether or not they are good people?
I think we do it by comparing ourselves to others. And the others would be people who are obviously not as good, so to speak, as we are.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I know I killed 4 people, but he killed 8, so I'm better than him. I must be a good person, right?
Right.
Or I didn't steal near as much as our politicians, so I must be a good person. That's exactly right. We go to social media and look to see what other people are doing and that kind of stuff, and absent a Bible or whatever. So anybody else have any other things that they came up with on how we measure ourselves? Don't we sometimes measure ourselves by our wealth, how much we've accumulated?
Yeah.
We tend to think that, we can't take it with us, but if we leave it for our family or whatever, but the truth is if we accumulate wealth and we use it for good, that could be a way. Maybe it's not how much we accumulate, it's how much we donate or that kind of stuff. I watched this one movie here recently where it was about the Freemasons and everything. And one of the things that one of their principles is giving to others and being benefactors and being generous and stuff. And it said, this one guy said that, if you donate thousands of dollars to the United Way, but you won't buy a sandwich for the guy on the street corner, are you really being generous and things? So
Good point. Yeah.
When you're go ahead, Keith.
I said that was a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to be selective. Somebody will ask us, you go into a grocery store and say, do you want to give $1 to Jerry's kids? Well, some of us say, we've already got our places that we donate to, whether it's through our church or other things and that kind of stuff. And so it doesn't, if you say no, it doesn't mean you're a bad person, but it's just kind of like even with tithing and stuff, or being a good person, you know when you're good and you know when you're not. So anyway, okay, back to the scriptures. Amos had just told the people that you guys are so bad that God's coming for your king. Now, even though these were God's words given to Amos, you can almost see him grabbing his head and saying, oy vey, he's going to get me in so much trouble. But Amos is a good servant. He's taking what he was told to do and how he was supposed to say it. And he's speaking his truth or God's truth. And, but now he has spoken against the current king Jeroboam. And back then is a lot like today, that if somebody puts something on the internet that says, I think I'm just going to take a sword and go to DC and go see Joe Biden, that person's going to they're going to have about 400 FBI agents combing through their internet, their cell phone records, and everything they've ever written, said, or done, and talking to all their family members and everything else, because you just don't make threats, against high government officials. So, these words don't sit well with government. And so when Amos says this, Amaziah, who is the high priest of Bethel, thinks, I've got him now. So he goes and he runs to the king and he tells on Amos. And he more or less tells the king that Amos is making threats to the king himself and that all of his people are going to be led away in captivity. Now, scripture is kind of interesting here because it doesn't say how or even if the king responded. If the king took it serious, there probably would have been 20 soldiers that would have gone out there and captured Amos, and no trial, no jury would have, just killed him immediately or escorted him to the gates and say, be gone. But we didn't hear of any response whatsoever. And so that's, maybe he didn't take it serious. It's like, just another guy down in the corner screaming like a crackpot. But in the back of your mind, you could almost hear Amaziah saying, how dare you show up at the temple or a school board meeting and question our idol worship or our teachings? Or how dare you come to Bethel, Washington, D.C., and prophesy or protest against Samaria and all that we've done for you? It's, Amaziah is trying to use his position and his knowledge and everything to try to just shut Amos up and that kind of stuff. And he's more or less saying, Amos, you're a traitor and a terrorist. And at least the thought was it was time for Amos to leave. Not that he needed to be put to death or anything, And so again, Jeroboam seemed to treat the charges against Amos with indifference based on this total silence. So Amaziah then takes it on himself to go back to Amos and try to chase him away. He goes to Amos and he tells him, he says, you need to go back to Judah and you need to eat bread and prophesy there. And basically he's telling him, you need to go make your living as a prophet somewhere else. We don't want to hear you anymore. We don't like the words you're saying and that kind of stuff. And this was kind of a reflection of the time and pretty much of today too, that if somebody doesn't like what somebody's saying, they try to either belittle them or destroy their credibility. So he's doing the same thing here. And remember too, that Amaziah was not a true Levite priest. Remember, all the Levites went to Judah and Jerusalem to be priests down there. So through the ages, the kings have had to appoint their own priests. And just like any government, they probably appointed their brother-in-laws and their sisters' cousins and everything else. But these weren't real true priests. Some of them may be trained. Some of them may have believed in God, but they certainly let the temples be abused and everything else. But these fake priests had no patience for a true prophet like Amos, who had been chosen by God instead of a king. So Amaziah resorts to accusing Amos of conspiracy and an insurrection. And Amaziah kind of uses the home court rule that, how dare you come to our town, our country, and our backyard? This is the king's property. This is where he lives. This is his sanctuary. How dare you come here and tell us what we should or shouldn't do? And so Amos, being a true servant of God, he comes back with a response that is very common sense. He tells Amaziah, says, look, I didn't ask for this job. I wasn't trained to be a prophet. My father wasn't a prophet. I didn't come, this is not our family business. I didn't come from a long line of prophets. I was a sheep breeder and a fig picker, and God tapped me on the shoulder and he told me where to go and what to say. And sorry, you don't like my words. But now I'm doing what my God has told me to do. And now you're telling me to do the exact opposite. So who do you think Amos is going to choose? He's not having his life threatened at this point, but we did talk at the very beginning that perhaps Amos was one of the first prophets that actually wrote his messages down. And this could kind of tie into that Amos probably is or going to leave Israel or whatever, but the thought is that he would still write down his messages and stuff so that they could still be shared with people. And so this could kind of tie in with that as well too. Then he kind of concludes this section here with what some people might think was a bunch of insults. He says, therefore, thus says the Lord, your wife shall be a harlot in the city. Your sons and daughters shall fall by the sword. Your land shall be divided by survey line. You shall die in a defiled land. You could think he was coming back with, something trying to get to Amaziah or whatever about his wife or his mother and kids and stuff. But really what he was doing here, he was predicting what was going to happen when the Assyrians came to town. The Assyrians, if you want to live and you were lucky, you were going to be turned into a slave, and some of the women were going to become prostitutes. The men would probably be let off to be slaves in the field or build other cities and walls. But he says, your children aren't going to be as lucky. They're going to be dealt a cruel death, but they're going to be immediately slain by the Assyrians probably because they didn't have any use for the children, except for they could have turned some of them into prostitutes as well too. But maybe these were the younger kids. But he's more or less pointing out everything that if you don't listen to me, this is what's coming. So and the part that says your land will be divided by survey line. You can imagine that probably these people had fairly big estates and a lot of property. It wasn't just a little quarter-acre lot, with a 2-bedroom house. I mean, they probably had, rather large houses. So he's saying we're gonna reapportion your property and maybe give it out to 4 families or something like that. And there's other parts of the Bible. I think it's in 2 Kings where it says we're gonna bring in Babylonians and people from other nations and other cities to come in and take this land. So, and anybody that's able-bodied or whatever is going to be led away and die in a land far away. And Israel basically is to cease to exist as we know it. So that concludes chapter 7, and we're ahead of schedule. Any parting thoughts or comments on anything that we've covered today?
On the question of the king not saying anything in answer to that, I was just thinking it could very well be possible that once Amaziah told him, he just simply said, go get rid of him. And then Amaziah took it from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, we just don't have enough. I mean, I even looked through some of the other scriptures to see if there was anything, but there's just not a whole lot about it, because the rest of the Bible doesn't really mention Amos at all. And but yeah, we can only make a lot of assumptions about what may or may not have happened at that time. You would think that a king like Jeroboam, that had built up this country and everything else, if he was really threatened, probably would have killed him immediately. But since that didn't happen, and Amaziah was, would a king send a priest to deliver his message? Probably not. He would have sent soldiers, even if he wanted him to leave the country.
Yeah, he
would have been escorted by 20 soldiers or something like that. He wouldn't have sent the priest saying, tell him to go home. So, but yeah, it's hard to say. But I'm sure God had a little bit of a say in it and protected him.
Yeah.
So, any other thoughts?
I got one quick thought here. One of the commentary by Clark, it's another parallel. I see them, I think you guys probably see them all the time too, but with the insurrection that they're calling on DC, it's the same thing. People were protesting against the upper echelon, and some of them got out of hand in our situation. But I thought it was interesting in hearing, because they have preached against sin. They've held them up as exciting insurrection among the people. That's exactly what the government is saying happened in DC.
Yeah.
I think it was
Right.
wrong the way that a lot of them did it, but the rest of them were there because they had no other choice than to be there.
Yeah, it's just like the people that go to school board meetings and stuff. They want their voices heard. They're trying to get their will shared with their leaders or their board members and that kind of stuff. But so how do they respond? Well, we're going to call the FBI and we're going to call you terrorists and that kind of stuff.
Yep.
Years ago when they
we're going to
were,
belittle you.
go ahead. Years ago, they were going to close Lincoln School, and we parents went to the board meeting, and there were 20 some of us that spoke, and it was within 5 seconds of the last speaker, the gavel went down and said closed.
Yeah,
They have no interest in
they're predetermined at that point usually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why bother?
Yeah, Yeah, well, the only retribution and that kind of stuff you can do is, at the ballot box. I saw an interesting quote one time about Frederick Douglass, and I thought this was a great quote. Frederick Douglass says that a man's rights all lie in three boxes: the ballot box, the jury box, and the cartridge box. And I said, that's a pretty interesting quote and that kind of stuff from, somebody that was trying to always argue for his freedoms and everything.
Yeah,
And
right.
I really like that one, but it's hard to post that or share that with anybody without you say, or someone telling you, well, you're not allowed to use that.
Yeah.
Yep, that's true.
You're not the right persuasion and stuff. That's for our people to use. So, but anyway, yeah, I tried to stay away from January 6th and that kind of stuff, but it's the same thing. What Amaziah did to Amos is the same thing that our government has in their playbook today on every little thing.
That's why I don't serve on boards, because I'll jump in with both feet and just say what I think about them. And that may not be the best approach, but that's just my approach.
Well, and part of the problem is you can be the outlier in the whole board or whatever. So every vote comes out to be 6-1 or something like that.
Yeah.
And then you get frustrated and say, what am I doing here? Other than you're shining light on it as well too. So, but anyway, anything else from anybody?
Thank you.
Thank you. Good lesson.
Thanks, Ken.
Sherry, you're looking good today.
Very much.
Thank you.
Well, it's that time. Let me stop recording.
Thought you already